Sorry. People online, is the video back up? Yeah, sorry. For some reason, the video often shuts off on this. So, okay. So there's the unsterilized foreign exchange intervention. Okay, the unsterilized. You won't be surprised to learn the other is what's called sterilized. All right, and we'll talk about the difference here. So here's our example. Let's say that the Fed sells $1 billion in foreign reserves for $1 billion. All right, so in other words, what the Fed is doing here is they're taking $1 billion worth of foreign reserves and they're trading it in for dollars. So let's think about what happens here to the Fed's balance sheet. Okay, what happens? First off, what happens to the Fed's assets? One of their assets is foreign reserves, right? So what happens to that? It goes down. And then what happens to their dollar reserves? What did the Fed do with those $1 billion? They take it out of circulation, right? So this is a $1 billion reduction in reserves. What's the change in the monetary base? Well, change in the monetary base is the change in C plus the change in reserves. What's the change in reserves? The monetary base has gone down by $1 billion. What's likely to happen to the money supply? It's going to go down, right? And that's also going to put upward pressure on interest rates. Okay. So what is this like? It's like an open market operation, right? It's an open market sale. Except the difference here is that instead of buying and selling T-bills, the Fed is buying and selling international reserves, okay? It's really the same story. It's just a question of what exactly is the asset over here that the Fed is buying and selling. Now, what's going to happen in the foreign exchange market as a result of this? Let's think about the dollars. Market for dollars. So remember from Friday, we have the demand for dollars and we have the supply for dollars. What's going to happen? Coming out, what's going to happen? Decrease in supply, right? The Fed has taken $1 billion out of this system, right? But something else, maybe just as important, is going to happen. As we talked about yesterday, what's the increase in the interest rate going to do to the demand for dollars? Remember, when interest rates go up, what happens to the attractiveness of dollar assets? They go up. This makes dollars more attractive. So there's also going to be an increase in the demand for dollars. Together, these work to appreciate the dollar. Right? Together, these work to appreciate the dollar. So when the Fed conducts an unsterilized foreign exchange intervention, in this case a sale, what are they doing? They're changing the monetary base, changing the money supply, changing interest rates, and also changing the exchange rate. Okay, and we just have not talked about that to this point, but that is one of the things that also happens when the Fed conducts monetary policy, right? They're also influencing the exchange rate. Usually, if you think about which of these effects is most important, it's the demand effect, right? Usually, I mean, if you think about $1 billion in terms of the total money supply, it's not very big, right? So while supply does go down, that's not the big impact. The bigger impact is usually through demand, right? But in either case, it's going to change the exchange rate. So if the Fed conducts a sale of foreign reserves, what does that do to the exchange rate? It appreciates it. If the Fed conducts a purchase of foreign reserves, that's going to depreciate the exchange rate. So just like you can think about monetary policy in terms of interest rates, you can also think about monetary policy in terms of exchange rates. Why don't we do that here in the US? Quite honestly, because we don't really care about the exchange rate that much, right? For us, it's the interest rate that's the much bigger factor. But as we're going to talk about, could you reconceptualize monetary policy in terms of exchange rates? Sure. Could exchange rates be the primary target of monetary policy? Absolutely. So while the US, right, the Fed thinks about exchange rates in terms of interest rates, we go to other countries and really their target is the exchange rate, right? Their target that they're trying to follow, they're not so much worried about their domestic interest rate, they're much more worried about the exchange rate. Let's think about another type of foreign exchange intervention. And this one's called a sterilized foreign exchange intervention. Why sterilized? In this case, the Fed conducts a foreign exchange intervention, but they offset it with an open market operation so that the monetary base doesn't change. So the Fed sells $1 billion in foreign reserves, and at the same time, they buy $1 billion in T-bills. What's going to happen to the Fed's balance sheet here? Okay, so let's think about this. The first transaction we already know. We just did it over there. There's a reduction in $1 billion of foreign reserves. And then there's a $1 billion reduction in bank reserves. Sorry to our online people. I wish that it was easier to read the board. So this is just the same we had before, but now what else does the Fed do? They conduct an open market purchase. An open market purchase. What does an open market purchase do? They buy T-bills and they create new reserves to pay for them. So what's the net effect over here on the monetary base? Change in the monetary base is 0. What the Fed has done here is they've just changed the nature of their assets. This, in your readings, is basically a swap. The Fed hasn't changed monetary policy. They've just essentially swapped foreign assets for domestic assets in this case. So why would the Fed do this? Well, there's a few reasons. Maybe the Fed thinks that they hold too little foreign reserve, or they hold too much foreign reserves, right? But realistically today, and this is what your article was talking about, more realistically, what the Fed is always under pressure to do from other central banks is to buy their currency and give them dollars, right? So in other words, buy their foreign reserves and give them dollars. Why? What did you learn from the reading? What's true about most central banks? Do they feel like they have enough dollars? No, there's this huge demand, this global demand for dollars, right? Because the dollar is the international currency. So all the time, central banks are going to the Fed and they're saying, listen, buy our domestic assets and give us some dollars so that we can have more dollars to hold as foreign reserves. Does the Fed want to do that? No, the Fed doesn't want to be holding trillions of dollars of foreign reserves. Why? Because they don't have to. And so this is the conundrum that's at the heart of our global monetary system. In some ways, the Fed is the global central bank. Everybody wants dollars, and the Fed controls it. However, while the Fed in some ways is a global central bank, what really does the Fed think about in terms of its policy? The US, right? So the Fed thinks about the US first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and 20th. And this pisses off other countries and other central banks, and in ways that we're going to talk about, destabilizes the global financial system, because we do not have a true global central bank. We just have one central bank that's a lot more powerful than the other ones. And so the fact that there is such this inequity in power in our global system means that, countries are constantly coming to the Fed saying, come on, we need more liquidity. We need more liquidity. Give us dollars. And the Fed says, no, go figure it out. Go out on the foreign exchange market and buy these if you want. But there's such this big global demand for dollars, because the dollar is the most important international currency, that there we are. What impact does this have on the exchange rate? Well, if it doesn't change the monetary base, it's not going to change the exchange rate either. or at least not much. I mean, I guess there might be a psychological impact of doing this or something like that. But as a practical matter, this is not only not going to change the monetary base, it's not going to change the exchange rate. But that doesn't mean the Fed wants to do it, okay? And that's an important point to understand that article that you read, is that, you know, I think a couple of you said, I don't understand why Fed just doesn't, you know, engage in currency swaps. These countries really want it. Well, because the Fed doesn't want to be holding all of these foreign reserves, right? It exposes them to a lot of exchange rate risk. And they just don't see why they should do it. They're not the global central bank, but they are, right? And that's, you know, I think that's the conundrum at the heart of our current system, is because we don't have a global central bank, we have one central bank that has the power of a global central bank, but without any of the responsibilities of being a global central bank. Okay, so this is sterilized, unsterilized, right? Unsterilized meaning you're really trying to change the exchange rate, right? You really will change the exchange rate. Sterilized is more a currency swap, where you're not really changing the exchange rate, but you are changing the holdings of your foreign reserves. Okay, now to progress a little bit deeper into this discussion about how central banks manage their exchange rates, we have to talk about the balance of payments. So balance of payments is something that we talked about briefly in Intro to Macro. And if any of you took international econ, you'd certainly talked about the balance of payments more. But the balance of payments is essentially our international accounting. It's essentially our international accounting system. It's a bookkeeping system. It's like a balance sheet. It's like a balance sheet. Except here we're kind of talking about flows across countries. So it's really a way of keeping track of flows across countries. Anything that is a source of funds is a positive in the US balance of payments, and anything that is a use of funds is a negative in the US balance of payments. Okay. This is like a balance sheet, right? Anything in the balance sheet is a positive if it's a source and a negative if it's a use. So this is just like in a balance sheet. The only difference between this and a typical balance sheet is instead of just having assets and liabilities, we actually have three categories here, right? What are the three categories? The three categories are the current account, often referred to as CA, the capital account, often referred to as KA, and the change in government reserves. We'll call change in GR. And what has to be true about these three accounts is they have to sum up to zero. Right? These three accounts have to sum up to zero. Okay, what's included in the current account? The current account is basically goods and services, right? The current account is where we include flows of goods and services. So when the US exports something, what is that? Would that be a source of funds or a use of funds? A source, right? This is a positive in the capital account of the US. What happens when the US imports something? It is a negative in the capital account because it's a use of funds. Because how do we pay for those imports? We pay for them by using funds. So the current account is essentially the trade balance. It's X minus M. It's essentially the trade balance. Why do I say essentially? Because there's some technical things that make it not exactly the same as the trade balance, but for our purposes, you can just think about this as the trade balance. It's X minus M. That's what the current account is. What's the capital account? That's where we include flows of capital and other forms of finance. That shows up in the capital account. What happens when a US citizen buys a foreign asset? Like, let's say I buy a Japanese government bond. That's going to show up in the capital account. Is that going to be a positive or a negative? Well, do I just get it for free? I got to use funds, right? It's got to be a negative. It's a use of funds. Now, in Japan's balance, or in Japan's balance of payments, what is it? A source of funds, right? It's a source of funds for Japan, the use of funds for the US. Just like what happens when a foreigner buys a US asset? That's a positive in the capital account. And then the third category here is change in government reserves. And this is really through central banks. What happens if a foreign central bank buys dollar foreign reserves? What is that in the US current account? Or I'm saying not current account, government reserve account. That's a source of funds for the US, right? When a foreign central bank buys dollars, they're essentially lending money to the US. And when the Fed buys foreign reserves, that's a negative in the change in government reserve account. here's the thing. What has to be true about these three accounts? They have to add up to zero. And what that means is that you can't have more sources than you have uses, right? Everything needs to be paid for in some way. Everything needs to be paid for. So think about the US, okay? What do we know is true about the US? What's true about our current account? Well, what's true about our exports and imports? We run a trade deficit, right? We've run a trade deficit for a long time. We run a pretty consistent, persistent trade deficit. How do we pay for that? We really pay for that in two ways. Our current account is strongly positive. We get net capital inflows from other countries. In other words, we are a foreign borrower. We are a foreign borrower. We've talked about this throughout this block, right? Why are we a foreign borrower? Largely because of our government and the attractiveness of treasury bills and treasury bonds, but because of the attractiveness of all sorts of U.S. financial assets, like the U.S. bond market, U.S. stock market, right? We attract a lot of foreign capital. That's essentially the way that we can always run trade deficits, is that we essentially are allowed to borrow. The other way that we borrow is through central banks. Central banks hold lots of dollar foreign reserves. Why? Because the dollar is the international currency. They have to. If they're trying to manage their exchange rate, they have to, right? So we'll explain the why of this here in more detail coming up. But for right now, you can just accept it as fact. And so the US really has this situation where no other country in the world could run the trade deficits we do. Why? Because no other country in the world could really borrow as much as we do. Okay. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, once again, I really encourage you in economics not to fall into the trap of thinking that things are good or bad. They have costs and benefits, right? For the US, what are the costs of this situation and what are the benefits? What do we get out of this? What do we get out of this? Anything good? You guys can't see anything good coming out of this. What is the purpose of economics? Why do we work? Why are we going to school? What's the ultimate purpose?
To make money.
To make money and to consume. What is this allowing us to do?
Make money.
Consume. Right? We get to buy a bunch of stuff more than we make. We have high relative standards of living. Right? The benefits of this is this increases our standards of living. we, in many ways, consume above our means. And I think this is one of the things that, if, for those of you who have traveled, you've maybe noticed, is you can look at the relative ratio of GDP in the US to other countries, and you'll see that they're, you know, pretty similar, right? Like, we're going to talk about China here in a second. You look at US GDP relative to Chinese GDP, and you see that per capita GDP in the US is, you know, nowadays probably 60% higher than what it is in China. But if you actually walk into an American's home and then walk into most Chinese homes, what do you see? The difference is much bigger than that, right? The difference is much bigger than that. In terms of actual standards of living, right? Actual standards of living, they are much higher in the US, and part of it is because of this, right? Part of this is because of this. We have relatively high standards of living and high consumption. Everybody should be so lucky to consume above our means, right? At least in the short term. Of course, what's the cost of it? Well, we are a nation of borrowers, right? There's a lot of foreign debt here. Does that create a danger? Possibly. Possibly. It is, I mean, to some people, it is alarmingly easy for Americans and our government to borrow, right? I mean, one of the reasons why it's so easy for us to borrow is the same reason why it's so easy for the government to borrow. And that is, so many different countries are willing to lend us money. It keeps interest rates low. This is the global savings glut, right? The global savings glut. That money just comes in here. And that's a good thing, except you can have too much of a good thing, right? And it's almost Halloween season, right? And I got little kids, and I know exactly what this is. It's great that the kids can walk around to people's houses and get candy until you see them come back with like 3 garbage bags full of candy, and you realize what kind of mess this is going to cause in the future, right? And it's kind of the same for the US, right? The US walks around and people give them money, right? They lend us money. But it may not always encourage good behavior, right? And so, yeah, that's largely the situation that the US is in. The fact that we have such developed financial markets is a big part of the reason why we have consistent trade deficits, right? Consistent trade deficits. So the trade deficits have less to do with what China is doing. And this is something that Trump and many other people have never really understood, is that our trade deficit is not going to change if we get in a trade war with China. The level of our exports could change, but the level of our imports will change too, as we talked about on Friday. So the difference between them, the two, is unlikely to change. Why? Because the difference between these two is more largely driven by these factors. A, that the dollar is the international currency, and B, that we borrow a lot from other countries. If we were serious about reducing our trade deficit, what would we do? Cut our borrowing and save more, right? If we cut our spending, we saved more, we reduced our foreign borrowing, you would see the trade deficit go down. That's a much more direct link. Of course, what does that require? It requires a little bit of sacrifice, right? Which, of course, we as Americans no longer seem capable of doing, right? So if we were really worried about our trade deficit, that's what we would do. We would not blame other countries for it, right? Because as we talked about on Friday, getting in a trade war will just reduce the level of exports, but it also reduces the level, or reducing the level of imports also leads to a reduction in the level of exports, right? So you're going to get less trade, but the same trade deficit, right? The same trade deficit. How about China? Well, as we probably know, China is essentially the flip side of this coin. And in fact, we are each other's enablers in many ways. China has a quite sizable trade surplus. Has a quite sizable trade surplus. A lot of it with the United States. But what's true about their financial system? It's relatively underdeveloped. So China has net capital outflows, which, if you think about it, is really quite remarkable. Given that China is one of the fastest, probably the fastest growing country in the world, second biggest economy, you would think that China would be a country that would have lots of inflows. But as we're going to talk about, they are basically net outflow, and they are a net foreign lender. Also, what's true in the government account? Less so than it used to be, okay? Less so than it used to be, but this tends to be, oops, I'm sorry, that should be a negative. That should be less than 0. The central bank buys lots of dollar assets. Why? In part, they're trying to do this to increase the trade surplus. Right? In other words, they're financing some of this. They're financing the trade surplus. Just like we did for the US, let's think about what are the costs and benefits of this for China. Right? And to some extent, they're just reversed. For China, what is the cost of this? Lower standard of living, right? Many Chinese manufacturers make goods, but who's consuming them? Americans, right? Not Chinese. This is, I will say, this is less true today than it has been in the past, right? I think China realizes that this has things have been greatly out of balance, right? Not just in the US economy, but in their economy. And to some extent, this whole COVID thing, coupled with the trade war with the US, has, in some sense, really helped Japan, or helped China in the sense that it has, kind of gradually moved China away from relying as much on trade surpluses as they have in the past. So the Chinese trade surplus actually has gone down a little bit. That's probably a good thing for Chinese citizens, right? The average Chinese citizen benefits from that in many ways. Why did China for so many years follow this policy? What did they think? What were they getting out of it? Well, one thing they thought they were getting out of it is jobs. Who cares who you're making stuff for, as long as you're making stuff, right? This was really to increase jobs through export promotion. And their idea was, one way that you can increase your technology and increase growth in the long run is to focus on making goods for international markets. And this is a strategy that's been followed by many countries in Asia, and to relatively good success, right? So the idea here is that if you're a country that is far behind the rich countries in terms of your technology and your human capital, how in the world do you catch up? Well, one way is to try to get in a small number of markets where you can really you can import technology and you can get some learning by doing. And so China is focused on a few industries where they thought that they could be competitive in and was able to import a lot of technology and do some learning by doing, right? The process of production helped them develop some skills and over time move up what we call the technology ladder, right? Move to higher and higher and higher technology industries until hopefully one day you get close to the top of that ladder, right? And that's probably where China is today. I don't think many people think that China is at the top of the ladder in many ways, but they're close to the top of the ladder, right? And this is a process that's taken place over 50 years. Part of that was following this export promotion strategy. But as China gets closer to the top of that ladder, the value of running trade surpluses and the danger, we should be clear about the other costs. They've lent a lot of money to the US. And that is a cost. Just like this is dangerous for the US, this is dangerous for China. You know, you might have heard people say that, you know, if I owe you $50, who's got the problem? I do. If I owe you $1 million, who's got the problem? You do, right? And that's very much what's true between the China and the US. Who's got the problem in that the Chinese government, Chinese central bank holds about $2 trillion worth of US Treasury bills. Who's got the problem? Both countries. Both countries have got the problem. Because what would happen if China sold all those, dumped them on the market? That would create a lot of instability, and that would hurt the US. But who would also pay? Well, China, because they would lose a lot of money on those $2 trillion of T-bills. So, you know, it's a codependent relationship here. It's a codependent relationship. And unfortunately, it's a relationship because of politics that has increasingly become one of blame, right? China blames the US for, you know, kind of being spendthrift and, you know, attacking them, right? China, for those of you who are not as familiar with Chinese history, China has seen itself as a victim in international politics for the last 1,000 years or so, right? And so there is definitely this victim mentality that China has and cultivates, right? And so it sees itself very much as a victim in all of this, right? And then there's the US who, you know, kind of has a, for lack of a better term, a semi-imperialistic view of all this, that, you know, we're the international currency and you should respect us and we can kind of do what we want. And then, of course, the US definitely falls into the problem of thinking way too much about the short term and not spending nearly enough time thinking about the long-term consequences of this. So anyway, that's the system that we have today. It is a system that not many economists are fans of, right, to be honest with you. To understand maybe why economists, or how we got into this system, right? For instance, how is it that the dollar is the international currency? Well, you know, I think to really understand today's system, you have to understand a little bit of the history. You have to understand a little bit of the history of the international monetary system here. And so let's talk about that. So we won't go all the way back, but we will go a little ways back. Sorry, let me find another marker. Let's go back to basically the gold standard. Which was essentially the international monetary system leading up to World War II. On and off, on during global wars, on again when we weren't in global wars. Okay. The gold standard was a system of fixed exchange rates. Right? The gold standard was a system of fixed exchange rates. So, let's say that a dollar, these are actual numbers, the dollar was fixed to 1/20th of an ounce of gold, and the pound was fixed to 1/4 of an ounce of gold. Then, what's true about $1? Or actually, the easier conversion is 1 pound. Right? $5. Okay, that's simple. It was a fixed exchange rate. So pounds were fixed in terms of dollars. If a country ran a trade surplus, then how did other countries pay for it? Right? If I export more than I import, then there's a deficit in that current account. Well, you pay for it with either a positive in your capital account or you had to pay for it with a, gosh, I'm sorry, I've got this all screwed up. Back. Okay, let's start this over. You have a trade deficit. You have a trade surplus. Gosh, I got to figure out which one I'm talking about. All right, you have a trade surplus, X greater than M. That means that your current account is greater than 0. Okay? What does that mean? Either your capital account has to be less than 0 or your government reserves have to be greater than 0. In other words, what you would get is you get gold inflows. You basically paid for differences with gold. So any country that ran a trade surplus would have a negative in the capital account that would have to basically be paid for with gold inflows. And vice versa. Sorry, my markers are dying here. For those of you online, I hope you can still read this. It's hard. You have it for those countries that have a trade deficit, meaning your exports are less than your imports. That means your current account is less than 0, meaning your capital account had to be greater than 0, or your government reserves had to be greater than 0. You had to pay for it with a gold outflow. Okay. Looks a lot like it does today, except the difference is you had to pay for it with a gold outflow. What's the problem there? Well, what determines how much money you have? How much gold you have, right? You can only issue paper currency based on how much gold you have. So if you have a trade surplus and you have gold inflows, what would happen to your money supply? The money supply would go up and interest rates would go down. And what happens if you had a trade deficit? The money supply would go down and interest rates would go up. Okay. So maybe you can see the problem here. What's the problem? What determines your money supply? Gold, which is determined by your trade balance. Does the central bank really have any control over your money supply? Do you really have any control over interest rates? No, you really have no control over the money supply. All right, so the limitations of this are many. You really have no control over the money supply or stabilization policy, right? So the way that we think of stabilization policy is what would happen during bad times. During bad times, you cut the money supply. Of course, here, what tends to happen during bad times? During bad times, you tend to run a trade deficit. So during bad times, you'd be forced to cut the money supply, and during good times, you would increase the money supply. That's exactly the opposite of what we know to be correct, right? So this would tend to be, you tend to get, during good times, money supply would go up. During bad times, if there's a worry that you're going to have a financial crisis, you see people pull the gold out and your money supply would go down, right? So, in other words, this really magnified macro volatility. Instead of being stabilization policy, it really was destabilization policy. And then there is just this question of why in the world is your entire financial system tied to how many yellow rocks you have? It's a fascinating question about how for so many years people thought it was so important that your financial system be tied to the amount of yellow rocks you have, right? So as a little aside, one of the largely not understood reasons why Britain was an imperial power was Britain controlled South Africa. South Africa was one of its colonies. During most of the 1800s, South Africa was really the only reliable source of gold in the world, right? And I think that's still true today. I think something like 60 to 70% of the world's gold was mined in South Africa originally. And so this gave Britain a reliable might be too strong a word because gold is not easy to find, and some years you'd find a lot and some years you wouldn't. But a fairly reliable source of gold that helped support their financial system. They gave them a lot of flexibility. But other countries really had no reliable source of gold, right? And so this really held back their financial development. And as we've talked about, it was the Britain's ability to get financially developed sooner than other countries that really in many ways supported their imperial designs. So this is a crazy system. It really is a crazy system. And when you hear somebody talk about going back to the gold standard, it is crazy town. At least talking to economists can't think of a worse idea than going back to a gold standard. How did the gold standard eventually fall apart? Well, it really fell apart during the two world wars. And I don't want to get into too much detail here, but I'll just say in brief that during World War I, many countries dropped off the gold standard because it was simply impossible for them to fight the war and pay for things without any gold, right? They suffered, many countries at the beginning of the war, there was panic and they suffered big gold outflows. And so if they would have stuck to the gold standard, it would have been almost impossible for them to finance their war efforts. After the World War I, and this became even more true after World War II, the US largely financed both of those wars. And so by sticking on the gold standard for most of that time, the US basically ended World War II holding the vast amount of the world's gold. And other countries had very little gold. And so it was going to be very difficult to think about how we get back to an international system in which one country holds all the gold, or the vast majority of it. And so that led to the creation of the Bretton Woods system. This was negotiated by the Allies who won World War II. And Bretton Woods reflects the fact that the US was the dominant economic power at the end of the war. And so the US essentially negotiated a dominant economic position in Bretton Woods. And so what Bretton Woods basically said every country in the world was on the dollar standard, meaning they had to back their currency, not with gold, but with dollars. And then the US was on the gold standard. Now, this Bretton Woods was actually one of the key architects of this was John Maynard Keynes, right? Who essentially killed himself. Now, he didn't literally kill himself, but in all the work that he did, he was ill at the time and you know, basically worked too hard and had a heart attack near the end of this. But this was the system that Keynes designed, but with one very important difference. Keynes really wanted an international currency. He didn't want the dollar to be the international currency. He actually wanted an international currency and to have an international central bank. In other words, the IMF, which does exist today to provide countries with lending, he wanted the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to actually be a central bank. To be a true independent central bank that was working on trying to provide global liquidity. But the US put the kibosh on this. And in part because the US realized, under which system does the US have a lot more power? This system, right? Because now the US very clearly realized that if every country is on a dollar standard, what does that mean? Every country is going to have to lend us billions of dollars. It's going to make the US essentially the financial capital of the world. And that's what Bretton Woods did, right? By making dollars so attractive to hold, it played a big role in making the US the financial center of the world after World War II. But it has created this problem, which we've talked about, that the dollar is an international currency, and to some extent, the Fed is the world's international central bank, but does the Fed really care about the world? Not really, right? They care about number one, right? And this is the conundrum that's at the heart of our current system. And so we have, the current system countries can either choose to float their exchange rate. Floating your exchange rate basically means you let supply and demand take over, right? So you can float your exchange rate, let supply and demand take over. You can fix your exchange rate. Meaning you can target your exchange rate to some other currency. In this global system, that currency is likely to be dollars, not always, but is likely to be dollars because the dollar is the international currency. Or you can do something in between, right? And we'll kind of talk about some of these in-betweens, but these in-betweens are something that, like, you can float within a range, but you're not gonna, if it gets too far out of a range, you're gonna intervene, right? But really, if you understand the difference between fixing and floating, you'll kind of understand these in-betweens, right? And so what we need to talk about now is how do you fix your exchange rate? How do you float your exchange rate? But my marker is running out, and this is kind of a long conversation. So I think maybe what I'm going to do here is let's just wrap up class a little early this morning, and then we will come back this afternoon. And really our topics this afternoon is to kind of analyze exactly how do you float your exchange rate, how do you fix exchange rates, what are the benefits of them, and we'll also talk a little bit about why Bretton Woods fell apart, right? Because I think once you understand the benefits and costs of floating versus fixing, you'll kind of see why this Bretton Woods system wasn't sustainable, right? So those will be the topics of conversation this afternoon. Yeah, remember to send me your homework number 4 via email, okay? All right, have a good lunch.